Afternoon, everyone. My name is Randy Ontiveros. I'm an associate professor of English. I'm also part of the U.S. Latino Studies program here and an affiliate in Latin American Studies Center and also Women's Studies. Thank you all for being here today for what I know will be a really timely and interesting panel. Before I introduce the members of the panel, I just want to say a quick word. This event today is this roundtable is co-sponsored by the Latin American Studies Center and by U.S. Latino Studies. And the reasons behind it, many of us here know, maybe all of us here know, that those two fields, Latin American Studies and U.S. Latino Studies, come from very different histories and have many different questions from each other that they ask. And here on campus too, the history of our two programs emerges from different directions. And the hope for this panel was that we could find ways to collaborate together institutionally and then also intellectually and politically at this very important moment in time. One of the things that was very clear to me yet again in helping to organize this panel is that the DC metro area has a long and historic Central American, U.S. Central American population and cultural traditions. And those traditions and histories, cultures, communities are not represented as they should be here on campus. And so the hope is that by partnering together, we can help change that. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to introduce the panelists. Ronald Luna, who will be moderating for us today, is the undergraduate director at the Department of Geographical Sciences here at College Park. He's been teaching at the University of Maryland for 10 years. He teaches Introduction to Geography, Developing Countries, Latin American Migration, and other classes. He served as a geography undergraduate advisor since 2002 and became the director of undergraduate studies in 2009. He's an award-winning teacher, and we're very glad to have him here moderating for us. We also have here with us today Adrian Pine, an associate professor of anthropology at American University, a militant medical anthropologist who has worked in Honduras, Mexico, Korea, the United States, and Egypt. In her book, Working Hard, Drinking Hard, on Violence and Survival in Honduras, she argues that the symbolic violence resulting from Hondurans' embodied obsession with certain forms of real violence is a necessary condition for the acceptance of violent forms of modernity and capitalism. In addition, she's done extensive research on the impact of corporate healthcare and healthcare technologies on labor practices in the US. So thank you for being here. Patricia Rodriguez is associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at the University of Maryland, College Park. She teaches courses in Latin American, Central American, and U.S. Latino literatures and cultures. She received her MA and Ph.D. From the University of California, Santa Cruz, and is the author of many publications, among them Dividing the Isthmus, Central American Transnational Histories, Literatures, and Cultures, which is from the University of Texas Press. I was at a conference this weekend in New York, and everybody was talking about that book. So, Alexis Tom Belson is the co-director of the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, a national grassroots organization that has been challenging U.S. intervention in El Salvador and Central America since 1980. CSPS works closely with the Salvadoran community locally and across the country to end U.S. policies that contribute to forced migration and other injustices in the region. And then our next panelist is Daniel Vivas. Daniel is the child of Nicaraguan immigrants and spent most of his life in Miami, Florida. He taught middle school in New York City for multiple years and is now pursuing his Ph.D. in minority and urban education, also here at the University of Maryland. His current work focuses on understanding the schooling experiences of young incarcerated individuals, and he's also interested in the role that schools and teachers play in creating a just society, the history of Central American students in the United States, and the pedagogy used in classrooms with high immigrant populations. So thank you all for being here, and I'll turn the floor over to Ronald to moderate.
Thank you. So once again, thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me and inviting our panel. So since the theme is home, I think we're going to start with the first question that addresses the numbers of high school or Hispanic students at higher education like University of Maryland. So the question is, what can we do, or what can higher institutions do like Maryland to attract, retain, and graduate Hispanic students, particularly from Central American backgrounds, and hopefully get into higher education like master's and Ph.D. So we'll start with Patricia Rodriguez and then work our way here, and then we'll restart again.
Let's see. Is this working? Okay. Well, good afternoon. Appropriate place to start, home, not only the University of Maryland, but also since I teach here. My name is Patricia Rodriguez, and I've now been at the University of Maryland for about, longer than I thought I would be, actually, because I grew up in California. I am a Salvadoreña by birth, came age 5. I won't make this long story too long, but I always like to say that I'm a 1.5er bi-coastal, because some part of my year I spent in California, in the Bay Area where I grew up, where the more historical Salvadoran community and Central American community resides. Nicaraguans, Salvadorans, and Guatemalans been migrating to the Bay Area since the 19th century. And then on this side of the coast, where we have a sizable Central American Salvadoran community that verges now like on 1 million people or so, some statistics show. So homegrown here, or home here at the University of Maryland, 17 years. And I have to say, even though administrators might say that, the student population of Latinos has grown, that we have more Central Americans, that might be the case. But I think we continue to see that this is a population that is not supported as it should be in terms of scholarships, in terms of retention, in terms of the pipeline from the high schools, the local high schools like High Point, like Northwestern, which is just up the street, that has an enormous population of Latino students, especially from the regions of Dominican Republic and Salvador, Guatemala, and other places. Those are the students, I think, that as a University of Maryland, we should be doing concrete outreach to, with the eye to bring them to the University of Maryland. I think there are lots of individuals here on campus, especially student organizations, that have historically worked to provide mentoring, tutoring. Ronald Luna, early on when he was an undergrad, actually had one of the first soccer mentoring programs in Langley Park. We have Langley Park down the road with middle schools that are majority Latino students that we should be reaching out to at a very early age. And again, there are programs here and there, but I think systemic support, monies need to be put into this. We certainly have the human resources here on campus. The students, have found, undergrad students are more than wanting to be able to work in the communities, and if we had more support, I think that we could do a lot more. So I'm gonna, put that out there, that support is needed. We certainly have energy. There's a lot of needs. Last semester, in one of my, spring of 2014, in a class called Salvadoran Transmigrations, we brought over 200 students from Northwestern to the University of Maryland for a full day of different kinds of events, culminating in a performance of Placas by Culture Clash that we were able to bring to campus. And I have to tell you that I busted my butt trying to get funding here and there, $100 here, $200 there, in order to provide lunch for the students to come join us, and other, and to pay other honorariums and everything. But if we had, that kind of support, monies and space and so forth, we could do so much. So anyways, I'll just start with that and maybe, come back.
Hi everyone, my name is Alexis Tom Belson. I work with CISPIS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. I'm very honored to be on this panel, especially as a non-academic. So I definitely know that there's other people who can speak a lot more to this question than I can, so I'll just share a very little vignette in terms of what CISPIS has experienced in terms of organizing young, a lot of student activists and a lot of Salvadoran and other Central American student activists, and this has been something that we've seen shift in our organization and in other organizations that we work with also over the last, I would say, 5 or so years, and I think it coincides also with, in the case of El Salvador specifically, the sort of rise of Salvadoran student activism in the United States is becoming much more articulated in terms of, being something that is driven by Salvadoran youth growing up in the U.S. who have felt very invisible in terms of a lot of overall sort of Latino organizing, especially in California, and sort of are trying to carve out a space specifically for, what does it mean about Salvadoran identity and Salvadoran diaspora identity, and a lot of this is happening in university settings. And it's a lot of really interesting conversations happening because there's questions about, should we be a Central American identity group? Should we be a Salvadoran specific group? And I had a conversation with someone from UC Riverside the other night who's actually Guatemalan and who was the children of Guatemalan immigrants, but who was the regional director of the Salvadoran Student Union group on her campus, because that was the space where the Central American experience, Central American identity questions were being more articulated. And I think in terms of just as an observation, as an outsider to the academy, what we've seen in some of our, sort of work with students in California is that one thing that has really sparked a lot of young people, students in undergraduate, to pursue graduate and PhD programs has really been an invitation and an opportunity by faculty to collaborate on research, specifically about Central America, about Central American history in the United States, about migration, about transnational identities, and to the extent that we're losing our activists because they all just want to go to get PhD programs, which is wonderful. We're like, no, wait, we just organized you to become our next, chapter leader, and they're like, no, I'm going to get my PhD, and it's a lot because there was faculty, who made a specific invitation to collaborate with undergraduates on research that was very connected to people's. And this, again, is anecdotal, so I don't want to make a generalization, but in these cases it was a lot to do with sort of discovering and prioritizing Central American agency in activism and in organizing history. So a lot of research about, for example, the role that the Central American community played in the Central America Solidarity movement as a leadership role, as opposed to just sort of the victims of US policy. And that has been something interesting that has sparked a lot of undergraduate students to seek interest in doing their own research. It has a lot to do with history and sort of discovering histories that I think, because of wars and conflicts, oftentimes parents were trying to protect them from those histories, and the experience of going to universities that then allow them to rediscover or discover those histories and actually be engaged in their own research as undergraduates, I think has sparked a lot of the people that we've been working with to want to pursue higher level of academics.
Can everybody hear me? I'm going to use my teacher voice as best as I can. So, mucho gusto. I'm Daniel. Thank you for having me. I feel very underqualified to be on this panel, to be honest, but I'll try to give the best answer I can. I think this question speaks to like a larger problem, and to me, and coming from, I guess, the College of Ed, I think it comes from the wrong place. I think we don't understand yet how to teach students in general, or we pretend to not understand how to teach students in general, even in the K-12 realm, and we can't even really speak about attracting them to the universities before we address that first. So something as simple as, we know that if a student comes to school hungry, they can't learn, but yet we refuse to kind of address that problem. A lot of our Central American students, a lot of our Latino and our African American students come to school hungry. We know that if we don't have pedagogy or curriculums where they can see themselves in, they're not interacting with the curriculum, or they're not connecting to it. And that causes kind of a drop off in who even feels like they can go to college. Just speaking from my own experience, it has always been kind of like this grind, this hustle. It was just, I know I have to go to college and I have to figure it out. I found that there was this thing called FAFSA, this magical piece of paper I had to fill out one day. And there's no kind of a college counseling in these high schools. There's not the resources at the K-12 level to push students into the university level. And there's also the question of whether that should be the place that we're pushing students to. We assume that that's what people want, and we assume that that's the best path. And we never asked the question of whether our education system looks the way it should look, right? It's been the same since 1897, or since right around Reconstruction. It's looked the exact same way. And it's one of the only things that we refuse to change at all. So I think it's a question that speaks to a much larger issue that we're scared to get into. We keep our answers in this little bubble, as opposed to kind of saying, like, why don't we stop talking about K-12 and higher ed? Why don't we talk about restructuring everything and what things should really look like, what society should revalue, and what role education plays in that? I'll keep my answer at that.
Thank you. I think this has been covered so well already, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief. I think you're right that we've had one model, but I think the one change recently has been that we've been privatizing so rapidly that we're increasingly excluding people, the very people we want to attract. In particular, in this case, Latino students, Central American students from this region in particular, and so I'm Adrian Pine, by the way. I'm a professor of anthropology at American University. And since I'm coming from American University, I actually feel like I'm in a little bit of a paradise here with all of the problems that public higher education has, of course, which is tied to public K through 12. You still have a multiplicity of faces in the room, which is something we have far less of at American, which is a private, tuition-driven university. And I think from my end, very selfishly, what I'd like us to be doing is more of this kind of cross-school collaboration, because I think our students would benefit so deeply from the kind of organizing, social justice drive that exists here. And we saw that last semester when students from UMB organized one of those vigils outside of the White House. It was just fantastic, and really so passionate. And my own students went to that and learned a lot from it. So I think that privatizing that's happening both in public universities and in private universities like mine is one of the primary things that needs to get addressed if we want to talk about these real issues of inequality, of hunger, of what is keeping people from attending the students, what is keeping students we would like to attend our programs from attending our programs. Additionally, let's see, Alexis brought up the idea of collaboration with faculty, of activists, academic collaboration, and that's been something that that has been such a central part for me, and working with Marci Capless, who's in the audience here too, is engaging myself and with my students in solidarity work with the Central American organizations in the community, like CISPES, that are doing such fantastic work. And although that in many cases, as Alexis points out, leads to the appearance of the activist world losing people to academia, what I would challenge us as academics to do is not allow that to be a loss to the activist world. What we have to do is to be fortifying activism and acknowledging at every turn our debts to Central American activism, to Central American individuals, and the models that they've given us for scholarship and anthropology. The anthropology of Central America is, not fully determined, but it's so infused with Central American ideas, and we have to make sure that we're not co-opting those and calling them our own. We have to recognize the importance of liberation theology models in our own scholarship, for example, and we have to be adding to that activism and not just turning it into an ivory tower thing that's apart.
So really quickly, just Ana Patricia mentioned something I did back in, God knows what, 98, I think. And one of the things that I think maybe we can allude to, maybe we haven't gotten to the things about like specific things that we can do. But one of the things that I did, I saw a necessity, and I went full throttle without any assistance, any help. I created a soccer program in the Langley Park community. And at the height of it, we had 180 students, and 12 teams, 36 coaches, all for free, nothing paid. It was just figure out. And I think one of the issues, if you have money, you can do a lot more, right? But I think money, someone mentioned, if it's a movement, movement don't need money, right? You figure out how to do it. And when I was in it, I got burned out. I did it for 4 years, 4 leagues and whatever. But then I stopped because I felt that I was not being appreciated enough. I was burned out. Parents treated me like I was the daycare for their children. But it's not until probably 10 years later that I began to see the fruit of that little initiative, and I began to run into people into graduations, and they said, "Oh, you were my coach." I said, well, "Yeah, I was, and now I'm not anymore." But they said, that program taught me something, right? And I think one of the things that maybe we can allude to when we go back is, what specific things have you seen that work, right? And what things can we actually introduce? And I think the question about pipelines, so you were mentioning about K through 12, right? Which to me, if you don't get an individual thinking about graduate school or university by the 5th or the 6th grade, it's almost impossible to get them turned around. So maybe we can allude that and then come back and then talk about, maybe as you talk about programs that you've seen that are successful, and maybe incorporate issues about identity, which someone mentioned as well. I think one of the things that we see, particularly in school, is that a lot of our children, particularly the 1.5 generation, the second generation, identity is very problematic for them, especially the language component. So maybe we can talk about programs you've seen that are successful, and then we'll come back.
So I came back here. I guess I'll piggyback with what Dr. Pine said, and she was talking about the resources, the Central American models, I think that a lot of us might use, appropriate, not give credit to, right? When she was talking about that, and she mentioned liberation theology, right? Minus the religious component of it, right? It is a pedagogy, if we think of Freire and that line of thinking, that is about social justice, right? I remember when I was in grad school and I would travel to Salvador during the war, and I taught English at the university, that it was all about justicia social, right? And it was at the sacrifice of lives, because we know a lot of students lost their lives. So being able to use these models and adapt them to our situations here, liberation theology, an education of the oppressed, right? Also, in the context of Central America, the work that has been done historically on comunidades de base, grassroots organizations, and the educational programs that were and are implemented, right, for the rural communities, literacy campaigns. It would be wonderful. We find that in our local communities there is a high level of limited literacy, especially amongst the immigrants. What would it look like if from the University of Maryland or AU or Georgetown, right, we collaborated on literacy campaigns so that our immigrant community would be able to acquire the literacy and able to, in order to be able to get better jobs, right? Even to be able to learn English. This semester I always like to do like a community engaged component in our class, and my students are volunteering on campus in the ESOL classes, English as a language, as a second language, right? And so the students are finding that there are a great number of our workers who have limited literacy skills. So it's very hard to teach people English when the models are based on literacy, right? So a concrete project that I'd like to see happening is the literacy campaigns, right? During the Sandinista period, the literacy campaigns in Nicaragua, right? I think we would agree with that, did raise the literacy level of a great number of peoples. And Padre Cardenal and other people used literature in order to get people to write, in order to learn about their identity, to learn about history, to become agents of their own literacy. So again, talking about agency and activism, those are some of the things that Central American communities bring to North America, okay? We are a culture of, beyond si se puede, si podemos, right? With very little resources. So you will see Central American communities, working, thriving, despite, a lot of odds. So let's, give credit, let's recognize the wealth that there is of resources in the Central American communities themselves. and in our Central American students. You know, I have to give credit to a lot of the Central American students here at the University of Maryland who day in and day out are involved in activism and community work in the schools, etc. So kudos to, you know, all of you and, you know, all the allies who are always working and doing things. So anyways, you know, along those lines.
Yeah, I won't add much because I have to take the opportunity that you very unknowingly set me up to say. It's just that there's a flyer on the back table because CISPAS is organizing a literacy brigade to El Salvador this summer because the Salvadoran government, after the leftist FMLN was elected in 2009, 35 years after it happened in Nicaragua, finally got to launch their own national literacy campaign, which is happening on a very grassroots, volunteer-led level, primarily affecting and benefiting women in El Salvador. And if anyone has any questions about it, our intern and former Brigadista Ruthie is here with me. But we're sending people from the United States this summer to go to El Salvador to learn from that model. And if anyone's interested or knows people who might be, please take more information. The only thing I would say in addition to that is it's sort of around the very specific resources, something that's been available as a resource in the DC metro area is a curriculum called Putting Central America on the Map, which is created by Teaching for Change. And the goal really is, especially around K through 12 education, to be able to, on all different age levels, be able to have resources that have people be face-to-face with images of themselves, their own histories, and not shying away from teaching very painful histories about the realities of the war, about the realities of forced migration, around militarization, around US policy to people as they grow up. I think one of the challenges mentioning resources is that the teachers who want to do that are trying to squeeze it into some extracurricular block, and it's not integrated on the level of DC public schools or Maryland public schools as saying, hey, this should be a part of every classroom's curriculum, but just as resources that are out there that are tools that people are trying to use, is one that I know teachers have been able to use pretty successfully.
I'm really loving all this love for Nicaragua. So we appreciate it. I was thinking about you mentioning liberation theology, and I have an uncle by the name of Ernesto Cardenal. You might know him, you might not. And I remember when I was a kid going to Nicaragua and going, to his artist commune. I was like a 5-year-old, him talking about loving my country and loving my culture, and my mother was always very big on that. And I think that helped me a lot in terms of like wanting to succeed for other people as opposed to just for myself. And so getting that feeling might be a place to start, like this idea of, and I think that idea of community exists in the Latino community in general, from what I've seen. Another place would be, so Dr. Jason Rivera, he's a doctor now, he's a graduate of minority and urban education who just defended his dissertation, wrote his dissertation on aspects of care and how that leads a pipeline particularly into the community college sector, but it kind of felt, if you read it, so it's a qualitative study of about 8 Latino male individuals, and just the idea of how much care and mentoring really helps getting people into college. Just the idea of having someone there that really believes in you, whether it's something as simple as, I think one of his participants got driven by the University of Maryland and his father would say, you're gonna go there one time. Another one, his father would make him pay it, I think in cash, to community college, and say, this is so that you know what it costs and that we're helping you, right? Like we're getting you there. That's another place, just caring for your students and reaching out to them and making them feel like there's a family on the campus. I think that's the only reason I graduated from college. I had a professor, his name is John Riofrio, who took me in as a son for the most part. I was gonna drop out of college and join the military. Like my older brother was in the military, and he told me, his words were, there are enough dead Latinos in the sand. And so it kept me in college, and I graduated, and now I'm here. And I think the last thing is allowing students to learn in their language is a big deal. We tend to focus on ESL in terms of like the most important thing you need to learn is English, and then everything else. As opposed to understanding that if I learn how to add in Spanish, once I learn English, I'll still know how to add. If I know how to write a thesis in Spanish, right, like because of this and this, I'll still know how to do that once I learn English. But we seem to just forget that. And so kind of using these pedagogical models, these systems that already exist, like translanguaging, will help students just become better students, and by default, I feel like you will push yourself towards college, or at least you'll feel like the community wants you to go, where right now that's not the feeling I think most students get.
Thank you. So since there's been all this talk about the Nicaraguan literacy campaign, I just have to mention an amazing documentary film, and Marci, I'm going to ask you to remind me the name.
Dawn of the People.
Dawn of the People, thank you, that Marci Capless was involved in making while she participated in the literacy campaign. So hopefully it's in your library, but it's a fantastic documentary covering that campaign, and so I'd really strongly recommend it to everybody as a model. And if you don't have it at the library here, we'll make sure that it gets here. So not much to add. I mean, I think what has been said is already really what we, at least as academics in collaboration with other activists, have to focus on is combining those two experiences. And I guess, and this is already implicit in what has been stated as well, and also in the previous stated notion that we need to be giving credit and working side by side with Central Americans, is that if and when we integrate community work in our classes, it should be as solidarity and not as service. So we have to be really careful not to replicate a developmentalist model, a hierarchical, a colonial model in our communities, including in our own universities, as well as when we talk about that in the U.S. Central American international relationship. And so, I mean, for us as faculty, that means more preparatory work. That means stepping outside of our we know best mold. That means really deferring to what really established grassroots solidarity activists are doing. And in my case, I mean, often what that means for my students is I tell them, if what you're doing is photocopying, then that's solidarity, then that's solidarity. Don't think that you're going to go in and teach people something more important than what they already know, or than what they believe is the right thing to be doing. So it's a lesson in humility, among other things. And I'm particularly thinking about the very white student body at AU in terms of thinking about how to be in solidarity with students and other people from Central America.
So we're going to switch a little bit now and talk about the other home, which is Central America. So this question comes from Randy. Randy, I'm going to try to compress it. March 11th, the U.S. Board of Immigration Appeal made the unprecedented decision that General Carlos Eugenio Videz Casanova can be deported from the United States to El Salvador, where he had been a senior military commander in the National Civil War in the 1980s. On April 9th, General Videz was deported to his native country, where because of amnesty laws in El Salvador, he now lives as a free man. So the question that I'm paraphrasing or changing a little bit is, what does this case and other cases like the deportation of undocumented, as well as MS-13 members or 18th Street members, as well as the individuals that have committed felony or other things, speak about this idea of transnational networks and maybe some of the issues that Central America is facing right now? So we'll start with Dr. Pine and then work our way back and then maybe come back. I know, it's very short. But deportation.
Wow. Okay, so I was thinking I would have a few more minutes to gather my thoughts, but our activists. So I mean, I think that the concept of home for me is such a great way to organize this conference, and it's even in the name, I think it exemplifies how fraught home is, because there's no real translation for home into Spanish, right? I mean, you could say hogar, casa, but it's not exactly the same, and I think that there's the not disconnect is not the word I'm looking for, but there's this disruption, right, that is undeniable. And I'm just going to stray with a brief anecdote. So yesterday I spent the day in Baltimore with a couple of a few pro bono corporate lawyers defending a client from Honduras who was asking for being under the Convention Against Torture to stay in the United States, and he had a very legitimate claim. He had been in prison in Jessup, I guess, for like 8 months. For almost a year. In prison, and see, I should have known better, but I thought I knew there were these detention centers and everything that everybody's been talking about, the privatization, but he was actually in a regular old prison, which is, I guess, where a lot of asylum applicants get farmed out to. And he was ready to, he said, no, I'd rather be deported and go back to a certain death than spend another week here in prison. And at the same time, I'm working on this with a couple pro bono lawyers, and the reason that they're doing is it's their way to cut their teeth in court. But these are the same lawyers who represent fracking corporations. They represent extractive corporations that are working, that are doing such horrible things throughout Central America. They're helping to drive people to the United States. As we drove in, the whole time in, they were making jokes about how dangerous it was going to be to go to Baltimore. And it just, to me, it seemed like a sort of conjunction of all of these forms of structural violence that highlight everything that is so terribly wrong about the way that we conceive of immigration, the very neoliberal way we conceive of immigration as being a problem of culture or a problem of individuals making bad decisions. And we don't look at the actors, like, in this case, we're talking about General Vivas, but, the actors involved. I could talk about the corporate lawyers who are defending corporations who are wreaking havoc in Central America and who are taking advantage of CAFTA and other laws to further exploit and subjugate people, who are then coming here and are finding themselves so multiply violated by our system that they are making the individual decision, in quotes, to go back and get killed rather than to continue being humiliated in the way that they get humiliated here. So, and that all, to me, that all ties in very clearly with what's going on in Baltimore, and the fact that people are leaving has to do with the same kinds of violence that we see in Baltimore. I'm not talking about violence of people protesting. I'm talking about the violence of having their schools shut down, of having their hospitals shut down, of all of this violence of neoliberalism that's marginalizing people. It's marginalizing people in the same ways, and instead of dealing with those actors and really bringing them to justice, the ones who are really responsible, we're punishing the most vulnerable. So I don't know that directly addresses that, but I wanted to get in there.
I don't know if I know even where to begin answering this, nor do I have any sort of expertise on this. But like a true academic, I'm going to give my opinion anyways. I think to me, home is just a concept of like almost a place, not that you own, and that might be the most terrible word I could use, but I'll use it anyways, right? Like this concept of ownership, a place where you feel safe, and I don't think that exists for many Central Americans. I know it doesn't, it doesn't exist for me in terms of, I've never felt at home in the United States, but I don't feel at home in Nicaragua either. And I have friends from El Salvador who don't feel like they're accepted here and don't feel safe in El Salvador. So I don't think home exists for Central Americans. So I think it's controlled by somebody else, someone up in the ether, or an actual individual, I don't know, the United Fruit Company maybe, but clearly somebody owns it, and it's not the people that live there. And I think that's a big part of what this question, I think, is getting at, why this general is allowed to live in freedom and without kind of fear, while everyone else has to live this kind of almost terrible lifestyle. And I'll keep my answer at that.
Yeah, I think the case, Vivas Casanova's deportation is significant in a lot of ways, and I think it got, very rightly so, it sort of got held up by this sort of legal and people who've been fighting for justice on any level for any of these cases that have just remained in complete impunity for so long as a major victory around someone on some court level was finally able to put out in the open and say out loud and say, yes, this is true, this is what he did, this is how he's going to be held responsible for. And I think what's really significant and in a lot of ways troubling about it was that that action was totally tied in with this idea of being able to displace any U.S. responsibility for that. I mean, that was not a part of what the case had to say. And in fact, the fact that we were like, we in the United States are not going to accept human rights violators like you being in our country, so you have to go back to your country, as if the two weren't so deeply connected, as if there hadn't been US trainers who were deeply involved in training the same military that he was leading, and the US's ability to really displace its own responsibility and to really otherize the Salvadoran military instead of acknowledging their incredibly intimate connections back and forth. Not only this that the United States had taken, billions of dollars for the training, but also that the U.S. has learned a lot from El Salvador's counterinsurgency strategies. And when the U.S. was doing the invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, Donald Rumsfeld said it's time to use the Central America, it's time to use the El Salvador option. I mean, those were his words, and that the U.S. had also learned a lot from El Salvador that they were then able to go and replicate elsewhere in the world. So to deny the very intimate relationship between the two states and between the two militaries and how connected they are in terms of protecting the similar interests was to me a very disturbing undercurrent of the case. I mean, there was definitely a victory, and yet there was this way of saying, this has nothing to do with us, and also we're going to put him away or send him elsewhere. And this, in a very physical way that we see with deportations on all kinds of levels, I think is replicated at every level around a total denial of U.S. responsibility, not only for the reasons why so many people have been forced to come to the United States in the first place, but what has been the U.S. responsibility in terms of how refugees in the United States have been treated, and then now we're just going to imprison people and deport them. And so this sort of cycle, the physical distance between the countries and the ways that this idea of like, we're going to send you away, we're going to send you out, we're going to send you back to people who are, some born in the United States who've been accidentally deported. This idea that there could be this separation when in fact on the political levels and on the financial levels and on the levels of sort of capital, it's all about making things as connected as possible. And yet, this way, I think the human rights case is an interesting example sort of a moral high ground that the U.S. is trying to take, which is unique to those cases, and it will be very interesting to see if that, this was sort of like a test case for whether this new precedent around not harboring human rights violators, which is just, when you think about this idea that it just sets up this whole imagery of like the United States has some sort of purity that's being tainted by human rights violators that shouldn't be here, that we have to expel, So there's, it's the victory of it is sort of, for me, very tied in with a very dangerous framework that I think is getting replicated, and I'll leave it at that.
Wow, that's a really big question, and I'm not glad to come after everyone because it's just so complex, right? And so anybody who knows me knows that I'm just, U.S. imperialism is this topic that just eats away at me. It took me a book to write to kind of get it a little bit out of my system, but to think that, a lot of those human rights violations were, kind of generated from this place, right? During the war, $16 billion plus were sent to El Salvador, if not more, as well as to Guatemala, another sum, etc., in order to, protect human rights. But yet, the violence was directly coming from this place. So it's very, you know, ironic, and the question that is always posed, well then why do they come here, right, to the seat of this violence? I mean, it's very complicated, as Alexis says. So we have to understand, you know, this violence beyond the, you know, the actors. You know, and I like to name, just like, you know, in testimonial fashion, to name, you know, the full name of, you know, these generals. General Carlos Eugenio Vidas Casanova, right? In order to recognize that these were actors, but who were funded and trained, you know, in great part by the United States. Think of School of the Americas and everything, and I think that's, you know, beyond complicity, that's the responsibility that in the US, a lot of us either don't know about or are unwilling to reconcile ourselves or to do something about it. But the legacy of that is very great. This is, you know, I think in part that violence is in part responsible for the great violence that, you know, is being generated today. So we can't disconnect the violence today from the violence of the wars and the violence that the United States in that Cold War period displaced to other places. You know, the Vietnam syndrome became El Salvador and Central America, right? The whole domino effect, and then the Salvadoran option in Iraq. So it just goes on replicating, right? I did want to say that, you know, for me, home, I mean, it's very hard to disconnect, and I agree with Danielle that, you know, a lot of us don't feel home there or here, right? You're kind of this diasporic, displaced subject. But in the case of Vidas Casanova, it's very interesting that, you know, that great migration of Salvadorans comes here. And very interesting to note that at least 2 of the plaintiffs for that case reside here in Washington, D.C., or did reside, Dr. Juan Ramagoso, and also Carlos Mauricio, who is the director, president of a project called the Stop Impunity Project that you can look up in the internet. And so, and along with another plaintiff in Los Angeles that struggled for years through the court systems, and, you know, and all this gets played out in, you know, immigration, right? Struggled in years to, you know, tell their stories, and their stories are they're atrocious, right? The torture that they endured, the aftermath of all that. Dr. Ramagosa, a medical doctor, surgeon, his fingertips were severed, his nerves were severed, so he could not practice surgery. And yet when he immigrates to the Washington, D.C. area, this need to care for this wounded population that was coming in mass during the 80s, he founded Clínica del Pueblo along with other people, and Clínica del Pueblo is one of the important centers that continues to provide medical aid for the uninsured. So we have the same Central American community, that grassroots community who provided services for their own peoples when, you know, the wounded had no therapy, had no medical services. So all these things are tied, and so for me, home also is like, you can't disconnect it in a very transnational context. We're here, we're there, right? And so what I would like to see is, you know, I think in great part that 1993 amnesty law needs to be brought down, overturned, and that's where I think that the Salvadoran transnational community has a role. You know, we can have dual citizenship if it was possible to vote and to overturn that law. That then would mean that, you know, all these guilty parties could be brought to justice, although, you know, given the context of justice and impunity in Central America, it might be very difficult. But I think that law